good morning to the Children and Family Scrutiny on the 14th of January to this short meeting, which is being broadcast live on YouTube. I think most of us have done several virtual meetings by now. So the housekeeping rules are keep on mute when you're not speaking, and do raise your hands when you want to speak. Now, I will be looking for hands. Joe Moore, who's the DSU officer assisting today, will be also looking for hands. If for any reason I miss you, do feel free to pipe up and let me know. So we don't want anyone to feel that they've not had the opportunity to speak because of some kind of failure of me to spot hands. Now, the final thing to say really by way of introduction is a welcome to Joe Moore today. Joe is taking Andrea Clark's place for this meeting. So thank you very much for standing in, Joe. So where you see Andrea Clark on the agenda papers, that should read Joe Moore.
Okay. Good morning.
First of all, apologies for absence. I think I had some apologies from people who are actually here, so we won't read those out. Any other apologies?
Yeah, the members of the committee are not in attendance at the moment. We haven't had formal apologies, Chairman. Councillor Bernie Fisher, Councillor Lorraine Patrick, and Councillor Colin Hay. Lorraine just joining us. Yeah, that's great. We are quorate. The meeting can proceed with the membership that we have at the moment.
Excellent, thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to give a specially warm welcome to our ambassadors, Becca, Barley and Tabitha, and of course to Dame Janet Trosser. Very good that you could come and join us this morning. Thank you very much. So apologies for absence. We've done declarations of interest. Are there any declarations? No, I hear none. Minutes of the previous meeting, which were sent out separately. Thanks to Joe. Are there any comments?
Could I just make sure that everybody's aware that the minutes that we're asking to approve are the minutes of the meeting on the 26th of November. The minutes of the meeting in December have not been published and are being prepared, and they will be considered at the next meeting, which will be in March, on March the 4th. So the minutes for approval that you have before you are the minutes of the meeting on the 26th of November.
Yeah. Are there any comments? No, well, I'll take them as approved and I'll virtually sign them, I guess. So now we move on to agenda item 4, the Gloucestershire Youth Offending.
Sorry, Chair, it's.
Hi, Chris. Hello, Chris. Chris, did you want to speak? Did you?
And Lorraine. Chris, we can't hear you. Are you muted?
Yes, he is.
Muted.
I just want to give you an update on safe. Hello,
Chris. If you take your video off, we might.
I think there's a delay on this.
I think this is Chris Spencer trying to speak, isn't it? Chris, can we come back to you? Just while we sort out. You might sometimes need to go off and rejoin the meeting if you can hear me.
Can I make an observation, please, if I may? Sorry, Chair, to butt in. It is not unusual when Chris is in one of these calls for the connection to be not very good. I don't know if other people have found the same thing, but certainly when other meetings have been the same. Maybe if we all turn our videos on.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
I think there's a delay.
I think Leslie, it also depends on the strength of the broadband from wherever you're dialing in. I'm not sure that Shire Hall actually has the best broadband, so it's so I think it is I think going to be location dependent, and just being in Shire Hall doesn't necessarily give you the edge on broadband speed. But Chris, your video is off now. Perhaps
is Chris in Shire Hall?
Excuse me, can I just say, all I wanted to say was that I will be switching my video off, but I will still be here.
Okay.
If you freeze. Okay, thank you. I don't need to speak again.
Thank you, Lorraine. Chris, do you want to try speaking again, Chris Spencer? If not, we'll come back.
yes.
Rather than for all that pain we've just been through, but I have followed up on the safeguarding issue, and my colleague Gail Hancock will organise a training event for members once per annum on our responsibilities as members in relation to safeguarding. That was an action point on the last set of minutes from November. So just to inform members of that action having been taken.
Right. Thank you very much, Chris.
That's noted.
Thank you. Okay. Can we? No, I think it's an important point. Actually, I don't think it's a trivial point at all. Can we move on to agenda item 4, the Gloucestershire Youth Offending Service recovery plan? And I'd like to hand over to Andy Dempsey.
Chris, Chris Spencer, could you just mute your microphone, please?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Okay?
Clear.
If people could give a thumbs up, thank you. Yeah, I won't put my microphone on, my video on. There's nothing lost in not seeing my face. You've got 2 papers with you this morning. One is the Youth Offending Service Recovery Plan, which follows a format set out by the National Youth Justice Board, and the other is the Cabinet report that accompanied the recovery plan through the approval process. The new head of the Youth Offending Service, Karen, was due to join us this morning, and she may well do. I think she's got caught up in some operational issues, but I will try to cover the main issues on this item. There's, as you know, there is an annual duty for a youth offending service to bring forward an annual youth justice plan. That duty this year was relaxed at a national level due to the impact of COVID, and youth offending services were required to bring forward a recovery plan which set out their operational arrangements to sustain services for children and young people involved in the youth justice system during COVID. The format really follows the flow of work. So what you'll see in the recovery plan is a narrative that sets out both the impact and response at all stages from the youth justice process, from first contact with children and young people in the police station, through court work, community work, out of court disposals, and all the way through to the secure end of the process. And that's, although it's called a recovery plan, we have in fact remained in a response mode. We've not really moved to recovery like other services. The youth offending service remains in a response posture, and indeed, now that we're in the 3rd lockdown with the more transmissible COVID variant, one of the things that Karen and the team have had to do is review the operational posture of the youth offending service. What that's illustrated is that the arrangements set out in this plan, which have been in place since March and were relaxed in the autumn but have now been reinstated, have served the youth offending service well, and they've worked very closely with partners to ensure that service is continued. So the youth offending presence in the custody suite, the continuation of Children First as a diversionary mechanism, direct engagement with young people where it's safe to do so, or the continuation of provision by virtual means, have all continued during the pandemic, the various stages of the pandemic. And as you'll see in the covering report, which went to Cabinet, which sort of summarises where we were as this plan went through the approval process late last year. Some of the work that we've done, particularly Children First and the continuation of the diversionary panel, meant that we didn't see what other areas experienced were a bottleneck due to the delays in the core process, with children and young people waiting to get an intervention. And all that implies for subsequent reoffending. So on the whole, I think the response of Gloucestershire's Youth Offending Service has been very positive. I think this is a nationally determined framework plan. Karen, who I hope will be able to join us at some point during this meeting, who was the main author with myself of the recovery plan, has done an excellent job in sustaining services. It's too early to say what the medium and long-term implications are in relation to offending and reoffending, although the emergent signs are relatively positive. And certainly during the period of the first lockdown, we saw a significant reduction in those aspects of crime, certainly that were community related. So I'll pause there, Chair, and obviously happy to take any questions or observations. I can't see that Karen's joined us yet, but that's the essential overview. What I would say is, although Karen's joined us, so I can see her in the meeting, and just for members' background, Karen was appointed as Kate Langley's replacement in March, so has had to pick up the cudgels of this right from the outset, and has, I think, been a really excellent appointment for Gloucestershire. She has a background as an ex-police officer, was also the head of education at Feltham Young Offenders Institute, so has a very good grip and understanding of both the education and criminal justice aspects of the work of the Youth Offending Service. So I'll pause there, Chair, and give way to Karen if Karen wants to highlight any points I've not covered.
Welcome, Karen, to Gloucestershire County Council and to this Overview and Scrutiny Committee.
Thank you, and apologies, there was a miscommunication, so I'm really sorry I'm late. So Andy, I completely missed the first part and came in when you said the word excellent, and that's all I heard, so I'm really sorry, everybody. If there's any questions, obviously I can help you with anything to do with the recovery plan. So
okay, yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, Karen. And I've only actually got one hand up at the moment, which is Brian Robinson. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you. Obviously, very good news that the court was able to carry on during the COVID situation, because I think that that was clearly very important and really a good example set for others that didn't take that on board. Two things that have struck me when I read the report. The first one was obviously the drop in youth work, which I can see would be quite critical for this area, but I understand why it's dropped. But I think we need to sort of note that that's obviously going to have an impact. But the second part that jumped out to me was on page 6, where we talk about the BAME and the general lack of trust. I'm reading through that where it says that, you know, if you're not prepared to admit your guilt, then you get treated differently. Whilst I understand the logic of that system, it does also seem to, if you put that together with the fact that we sometimes hear that the BAME are targeted more often, so are they guilty? I just wondered whether we were missing a sort of more important point here about how we work with those communities that have a different understanding of justice to what we have, because it could well be causing a long-term trail of damage simply because we treat people differently.
Thank you, Brian. Well, Karen, would you like to respond to that? After Brian, I have Leslie and Richard to speak.
Yes, of course, and it's a really good point. It's one that I picked up when I came here. One of the things we've got to be really careful of is that we don't push people through the process if they are not admitting guilt because they haven't actually done something. So there's always that kind of difficulty that if we're saying to people, look, we know you haven't said you've done it, but we're going to go through this process anyway, when genuinely they may not have committed an offence. So we have to be very, very careful about that. I think, as Andy mentioned, I'm an ex-police officer, so there's always that kind of, there's always this desire that you want somebody to admit or to, acknowledge they've been involved in some way, because then you feel like they'll be open to restoration and understanding and taking responsibility. And I think that what I will say is when I came here, because I've worked at Felton for a long time, and there's a very, very high cohort of BME young men in that offending institute. What I noticed was that a lot of them weren't willing to talk about what they'd done, but you could still work with them and they still learned. And so I'm really, really keen that here we consider, and everybody's been very open about this, which is wonderful, is we consider a way of how we process some offences where we know, we're pretty certain CCTV, etc., that it has been committed by that young person, that we work with them as we would as if they had admitted guilt. Because for me, what I feel is a problem is we're asking young people to have that maturity of mind and understanding to admit guilt at the very, very beginning when we've not had any work with them and any engagement with them. Whereas if we work with them for a number of weeks and months over time, the trust builds up, the understanding builds up, and they understand that their world won't end if they acknowledge that perhaps they have done something wrong. So for me, it's something, there's a lot of research across the world internationally about how it can work, where you don't need that perception of guilt or that admission of guilt. So I think it unnerves people sometimes. So we have to do it a little bit gently, but it's something I'm very keen on doing, is not looking for the guilt first. I think over time, and it will take a long time, we'll start to build up a different relationship and a different level of trust within the communities. If we're not saying, well, you need to plead guilty before you get an easier or a better way of being dealt with. I think we need to address that. It's going to take time. Does that help?
Very helpful.
Okay.
Andy, I think you wanted to respond to.
Yeah, it's just to reassure Brian and other members that issue is an issue for the whole of the partnership board as well as the Youth Offending Service. So we'll appreciate it involves the input at a board level of police, probation, health, education to address those cultural antecedents. And as Karen said, it won't be an immediate fix, and we need to balance the interests and focus on the young person with the wider duty to also protect the interests of the community. So it's an issue that we'll work through and perhaps provide more of an update as that piece of work matures.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. Now I've got Leslie, Richard, and then Stephen Davis. Leslie?
The first thing is, please, I need some clarification on the word you might have meant to use in a paragraph on page 3 of the complete report and page 2 of this report, where you've used the paragraph starts, the county summer provision was significantly impaired, primarily due to decimated because staff. And I just can't work out which word was meant to be used instead of decimated.
Apologies. Yeah, so you're right. Thank you. That's I didn't realise I'd done that. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that there was a lot of providers essentially went out of business or just completely stopped running. So it was a decimated provision is the word I was kind of saying there, that across the board.
So what you're saying is you lost capacity?
No, county-wide. What we're saying is that across the county, about 50% of providers across the county, so some very, very small charities or some very small groups with very small numbers of staff couldn't financially sustain their role.
So that is a loss of capacity. Yeah. The word decimated means 1 in 10. And so I was just totally muddled. So maybe if that could just be jiggled so that what you're trying to say is that, you know, that there weren't the numbers around to do the work, that would be helpful. But the other thing I wanted to raise was following on from Brian's thinking about the ethnic minority groups. So I wonder what training is given to deal with unconscious bias.
So we don't have any here that I know of in the time that I've been here. So I've been here since June, so we don't have that training here. I have been involved in that previously in previous roles, and it's been very, very helpful. And I think that there are quite a few things I'd like to explore just to find ways of balancing the scales a little bit more for, you know, certain cohorts, but we don't have that at the moment. It may have happened in the past, if I'm honest, Leslie, I don't know, but it's definitely something it's helpful. I'll make a note of that because I think it's
I really wish you would. I mean, we've all known and seen the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, if we really do want to create an equal society, and you talk about lack of trust, unless these difficult issues are addressed, you know, we're never going to get anywhere. And given that the numbers of people within the service are on the whole Caucasian, I wondered, you know, how you actually work with young people who come from different backgrounds to try and match backgrounds.
So I can give an example if that helps. So,
well, I don't think this is well. No, I mean it would help, but I mean, my concern really is that we're all prejudiced. Haven't all got the bottle to admit it, but we all do have prejudices, and it's actually being able to recognise them. But particularly with the unbiased prejudice that we know exists, that, you know, is essential, I think, to do something about, particularly in a service like this, and within the police service. So this is a recommendation that it's something that really should be considered. And I hope other members of the committee will perhaps support this.
Did you want to come in and comment here?
Yeah, could I comment as chair of the partnership board? Just on that, Leslie, the starting point for the board, and we have been working with this over the past year or so, is to improve the ability of the board to understand whether different groups of young people, based on their ethnicity, sexuality, age or gender, are overrepresented or disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. And that's the starting point. A number of agencies contributing to the Youth Offending Service will have received training in issues of ethnicity, for example. I know, and Chris can confirm, that training is provided to our social workers who form a part of the process. But as Karen has said, Leslie, it is an evolving and developing picture. The first challenge for the board is to ensure that the administration of youth justice in the county is equitable and does take account of those cultural and other antecedents and situational factors. And I describe it as an evolving and emerging piece of work. And we've asked, the board has tasked Karen to ensure that the future reporting develops along those lines to enable us to understand and address where we might have the signs and signals of disproportionality in the system.
Thank you, Andy. I think that was helpful.
Thank you, Andy, for that. And it is helpful. I'm not sure it really quite does it. I mean, and we know, for instance, it's really difficult to get people from different backgrounds to consider joining the police service, and just understanding it. I'm not quite sure what I want to say, but I think it is so important, actually, that we start to really recognise it, that whether we like it or not, we have a prejudice, and trying to get people to acknowledge that there are unbiased, there are, you know, subconscious prejudices that come to play in all these things will probably help with when young people are coming forward, you know, to think that there is a level of trust between the various parties who are involved. So, I mean, it's not an unusual thing now to suggest that that sort of training and continuous training goes on. So I'm just saying, please, can you find ways of dealing with this, sooner rather than later, because it's important.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just add a line there, if that's okay, please? Leslie, just in response, in terms of the unconscious bias aspect, which was the original point of the conversation, I'll happily take that away. Just in terms of the other work and the example, when we have young people that come through to us, that young person's story is taken into a group, and the programme officers sit and decide who will be allocated that young person to work with, and they take into account all the factors in terms of their background, their ethnicity, their etc. And they find an appropriate person to engage with them. Now, it depends what the offences are, etc. They do spend a lot of time making sure that the person that they link up with, that young person, it is somebody that they'll listen to, they'll engage with, and then we'll transition them on to somebody else if it doesn't work. So a lot of time and effort does go into making sure the child feels comfortable with the person that they're working with. We do have diversity and inclusion groups as a company, Sure Trust, but within Gloucestershire as well, there's a lot of work that goes on regularly about diversity and inclusion, and it's going to continue to evolve for a very, very long time. We're not finished. There's a lot to do. Your unconscious bias point is helpful, definitely, but please understand we are really, really empathetic to the young people, and we do everything we can to make sure, because if we're giving them someone they're not going to engage with, we don't get anywhere with them anyway. So it's really important. Andy, thank you.
Thanks for that, Karen. Chris is look, this is an important subject here, and it's important across the whole of the criminal justice system. So Chris, you wanted to come in here.
You can hear me now. I've relocated and fixed my Wi-Fi into a better position. So apologies for earlier problems. I have put into the chat 2 or 3 quick points, and that is that we do now take into account ethnicity in our practice fundamentals. That's been introduced to social work over the past year, 18 months. We also have had training delivered to social workers about the impact of ethnicity during the assessment process. And finally, we have just recently asked for a representative from a Black and ethnic minority group to attend the Social Work Academy Board to advise us on such matters. So just 3 quick things. I don't pretend that we're ahead of the curve, but we are catching up with it.
Thanks, Chris. I think it's important to bring those points forward because clearly it's a very sensitive topic. I've got Richard.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Karen, for a very comprehensive report, which was both interesting to read and, from my point of view, educational. I'd like to follow actually the theme that Leslie raised, but not specifically in the context of the BAME community. You do note in paragraph 2 that young people don't trust authority, and I think that's widely accepted. And also you note at para 7.1 that the pandemic and the lockdown and all that goes with it is likely to increase the levels of anxiety for young people generally. And so this is really across the young people community. What I'm really interested in here is that one of the signs of increased levels of anxiety, exposure to traumatic experiences, of course, can be aggression, which can be fueled as well by mistrust against authorities generally. And I think it's actually not just young people, but we'll keep it young people for today. My root question is what additional support and advice are we giving to our staff on how to counter the distrust that young people have in authority? Does that make sense?
Good question. Karen?
So I think because the nature of the work that our staff do, they work with these children in situations where, for the most part, they're not in crisis at that moment. They're speaking to them after the event. It's usually the police have had to deal with the initial incident, and then we have the luxury, if you like, of time and care afterwards. So we tend to build up and we educate them. We decide, we do a very thorough assessment of the child, the incident, and their home life, and the existing challenges they've got. We also look at what things are going well for them and what are the protective factors that are positive in their life. And then what we do is we create programs to support that child in their needs. Now, some children react really, really well to being, to talking about their background and their life and their situations, and others just can't in any shape or form. So we tend to refer them where we need to, because within our service, we've got a lot of integration. So we've got CAMS, we've got speech and language, we've got physical health nurse, substance misuse teams. So within our world, we've got a wonderful amount of resources where if we're struggling with a young person we just can't get into them, we can go to any one of our colleagues who might have a better chance. Now, in terms of how to cope with their emotions, you've made a really good point. It's not just the children that are struggling, we all are struggling with that. And I think that what we try and do is we just try and give them space to talk about what they're feeling. They're going to continue to spike. I've been at work at times and I've heard a young person getting very irate outside because their buttons are being pushed and they're being asked to think about things they don't want to think about. And all we can do is just show them teach them how to try and find ways to cope with that. It's not easy, and it's all about just constant, consistent support. And then to a certain extent, they start to feel safe. That's all we can do. And it's the same with children's social care, is to try and make them feel safe as much as possible. And then that tends to reduce the anxiety. And if they do behave in a poor way, because we've got the Children First process as well, the out of court diversion scheme, we can be really empathetic, and Gloucestershire is ahead of the curve by a very long way in terms of diverting children away from the court process. So where a child does get it wrong, we are really, really thoughtful about it. It's the child first, the behaviour second. So actually, in a lot of other counties, they would be arrested, charged, go to court. In Gloucestershire, for the most part, we protect them, and it's almost like they get to make those mistakes within reason, and then they get to deal with it offline, away from the justice system, for the first 2 or 3 times. If that helps with the question, if that answers the question. So I've lost you on the page now because there's so many people.
Yeah, I mean, that's really helpful in terms of the child. And my other sort of area on that one, which I alluded to, was actually the impact on your staff, the staff within the partnership, and what additional support, if any, is required, are we giving them, or at least are we conscious of the increased stress levels, etc., that could, of course, lead to staff sickness and all the rest of it in the future, which leaves us further decimated or depleted.
I can answer just very quickly. All staff have supervision as well, so that once a month they have a very lengthy supervision process. We have a health assured support process, counselling. So I think it's the same across Gloucestershire, where staff are working frontline with these very, very difficult situations. There is a huge amount of support, and also we touch base. Particularly now, we have very, very regular coffee mornings that are all virtual, which actually more people can come to than they would have done if they'd been in person. So, swings and roundabouts and positives sometimes. So we're definitely keeping an eye on people. And so far, what I will say, our staff have been incredibly resilient, absolutely brilliant. They've been really, really amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. It's good to hear that our staff are being resilient, because you certainly need to be resilient these days, don't you, with the strains and the stresses that we've got on, which are new to many of us. I've got Stephen Davis and no other speakers. So, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make comment on the training around, what's the word? Unknown prejudice, because I have to say the quality of that is important. We've seen an awful lot of poor cases of that, where I don't think it really helps, but people tick a box, say they've taken some training, and I'm just conscious about that. I just wondered if there are any thoughts on that. And then I had a second completely different question, which was, I read this report and it's titled a recovery report, and yet I found it very short of anything that was measurable. And this may be from our experience and in this work we're doing around our own service, but we spend a lot of time clawing over statistics and numbers that says things have happened or not happened and they've got better and more things happen. This report seemed very light on metrics. So if it's recovering, I'm interested in what it's recovering from and how you measure that, and how in this report we can then look at, say, a future report and say these indicators have improved. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on metrics. Thanks.
So,
thank you, Stephen. Karen, can I also hear from Andy? Because Andy, you were talking about the service still being in a response mode, weren't you?
Sorry, Andrew. Yes, could I respond first and just set the scene? Stephen's absolutely correct. The report is probably incorrectly named. It's not a recovery plan, it's a response plan. Unfortunately, the terminology and format for the plan was determined at a national level, and we would have much rather called it a response plan because it does outline our response arrangements. What I want to reassure members is that the Multi-Agency Youth Justice Partnership Board has continued to meet during the pandemic, and we continue to receive regular reports on key performance indicators, primarily but not exclusively, the levels of first-time entrants into the criminal justice system, the level of proven offending and reoffending, and the use of custody. And on the whole, our performance has remained strong, in good part, in my view, due to the positive work done through Children's First, which has continued. So you're absolutely right, Stephen. It is not and when we pulled this together, and Karen was working on this, we both felt it was incorrectly named and probably wouldn't have followed that comment. Reports for the service, the meeting to all members, how performance has developed over the pandemic. So it is very much a narrative of operational arrangements. It doesn't include a huge number of performance measures, but those have continued to be reported to and overseen by the Youth Justice Partnership Board.
Thank you, Andy. Karen, would you like to add to that?
I think Andy broke up a little bit at the end, but I think it was quite a succinct point, and I will just clarify that it was written in the summer because obviously we were told that we need to produce. You'll see in my narrative very quickly I wrote that we didn't feel like we might be coming out of this anytime soon. When it was first, aired as actually, can you all write recovery plans? Just talk about how you're going to come out of COVID. I think at that point people thought we were coming out of COVID probably towards the end of the summer. So this was kind of circulated about June, July time when we were asked to write it. So you're right, it's not the appropriate name. So it's a very good point. In terms of the data, as Andy said, a lot of the data hadn't been produced at that point because of the nature of COVID landed kind of March time. So we'll be able to see in the next cycle the impact. But as Andy has said, that things remain quite consistent in spite of everything that's happened. The numbers, there's no real spike or any deficit in terms of numbers of first-time entrants, etc. So more than happy to supply some data down the line, which will be useful in terms of comparative use. But at the moment, when I wrote it, you're right, it was more a narrative about the situation we're in and what we might be able to do in the future. But we're still in the exact same situation, if not actually slightly worse at the moment.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Well, I mean, who this time last year, who would possibly have expected it? Even in April last year, who would have expected that we'd still be in lockdown in January? So yes, I think you can be forgiven for that one. I don't have any more hands. If you want to ask any more questions, please do let me know very, very quickly. No, in which case I'd like to thank you very much, Karen. And to move on to the next agenda item, creating a child-friendly Gloucestershire with Dame Janet Trotter. Over to you, Janet.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I hope you can hear me. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. I will do part of this, and my co-conspirator, Andy Dempsey, will come in a bit later. You have a paper in front of you, which is a very different style of paper to the one that you normally have, and a few pictures and colours and so on. And this was a document that we used to promote Child Friendly Gloucestershire at its launch recently. If I can just go back to the origins of Child Friendly, the Police and Crime Commissioner asked me about 2 years ago if I would look at what we were doing for all young people in the county. So there are lots of plans in the county for particular groups of young people, but actually there isn't anything that is universal and that takes account of what we're really trying to do for all young people in the county. And I have said in the past that my own view is probably that we are not sufficiently ambitious for all of our young people in the county, that they can achieve their full potential. So we've been working since then and doing a fair amount of analysis and going out to organisations and to young people. And three things have emerged from the analysis that we've done. And if I'll put these in a sort of deficit mode, if I can. So first of all, there is no overarching vision for all young people in the county. We don't have a vision, we don't have a strategy for all. Lots of plans, but nothing that sums everything up. And particularly important in that is not a common set of values that all organisations share in relation to the work with young people. Secondly, very often when services are developed and plans are made, the diverse voices of young people are not heard, they're not garnered particularly. And that has become particularly acute. So how do we go out to gather the voices of all young people, those people who are not often heard? We hear clearly the voice of those that have and those that are probably aspiring to go on and do great things. But actually, a lot of voices are left behind and we're not gathering those up. And I think that is an issue for us. And the other issue that we've found when talking to people involved with young people is that the statutory sector and organisations very often don't draw in the voices of voluntary organisations or third sector organisations. So the provision for young people is probably more atomised than it might be. So having looked at all of that, we have come to the conclusion that it would be good to draw, we're calling it a coalition board together, which will report to the Health and Wellbeing Board. And this Health and Wellbeing Coalition will seek to do a number of things and focus on a number of things that are at the top of young people's minds as we understand them. And one of the pieces of work that we're going to do a deep dive into is pre-birth to 5 years old, work with the very young children and those people who support them. And that's partly derived from the fact that we are falling behind our comparative group in the provision within the county. The second area is mental health provision, and a lot of young people are saying to us that they don't have access to the mental health provision that they would like or that they feel they need, and this is an issue that we need to pick up. There was an independent piece of work done by the County Council some time ago, and it suggested that Gloucestershire was an outlier in the number of young people diagnosed with a mental health issue, and the statistic was 20% diagnosed, let alone those people who are not diagnosed. And the third area that we think is important to pick up, and particularly in these COVID days, is those young people who want to transition or are transitioning from school or college to employment, and what skills, what advice, and what information they get at that point. And very often what comes back to us is that if you want to go on to university, fine, you get plenty of support, but for other people wanting to go into other areas of work, there is a lack of information. So that's what we're embarked on. We want to be active. We want to make a difference. There's no point in us being in existence if we don't make a difference. And one of the key pieces of work that we will also be doing is, and it's been said today, you know, young people don't like authority. I might question that at times. But it is difficult to get through to understand young people, to listen attentively to where they are, and to try and make sense of the world, or help them to make sense of the world for themselves and to develop their potential. And many of them are pretty traumatized by COVID. So we will be wanting to do quite a lot of work on how do we understand young people, how do we work with young people to get the very best services in the county for them. And we see this as meeting the Section 10 requirements of the County Council. So it's squarely within the work of the County Council. We have moved much more slowly than we might have liked because of the pandemic, but we're now up for movement and meetings. And I think it's important to say that we welcome coming back to the to this committee, the Audit and Scrutiny Committee, periodically, because we want to be held to account and to be making a real difference for young people within the county. And with that, I can hand over to Andy.
Very much, Joanna. Particularly, I liked your last comment about the involvement with the committee and being held to account. That was particularly welcome. But Andy, can I invite you to respond to that?
Yes, Chair. In your papers, there's a copy of the PowerPoint. It starts on page 33. This was the launch PowerPoint that we used. I won't go through all of it, Chair, but if I could just highlight briefly a number of points. On page 35 is where much of our focus generally starts with children and young people. This is the smaller number of young people, too many I would say, but the focus on safeguarding, where generally we've got around 4,000 children open to children's social care, and we have around 10,000 contacts. You can see there received in a 6-month period, around 20,000 a year. This isn't about safeguarding. This is about well-being. Local partner agencies have a duty under Section 11 of the Children Act to work together to safeguard children and young people. However, under Section 10 of the Children Act 2004, there's a duty placed on Gloucestershire County Council, and within that, the Director of Children's Services, Chris, and the lead member for Children's Services, Richard, to work with partner agencies to promote the well-being of all children. And that is really the sort of bigger challenge around, you know, the 120 odd thousand children living in the county and their education, personal, social, health and cultural development over the longer term. And if we look at page 37, Gloucestershire, there's a child health profile which draws together a range of metrics nationally, and they provide a profile of localities at the local area boundary to enable localities to understand how they're faring in comparison to others. And the phrase on slide 4 sort of sums up where we are, that in most cases our indicators align with England averages. But given the demography of Gloucestershire, we probably should be performing a lot better, and that's captured on slide 5. As Janet's alluded to, although universal outcomes are generally in line with England averages, there are, I won't go through them all, but there are some obvious underlying issues. One is the demands, increasing demand placed on children's social care, and the proportion of that work which comes to the attention of social care but doesn't require a social care intervention, but probably requires something at a lower level. The gap in outcomes for vulnerable and disadvantaged children is too wide, and it's continuing to grow in some cases. Our proportion of children achieving a good level of development at early years foundation stage has improved more recently, but again, there are gaps. And something that Chris has, I think, highlighted consistently, and we've picked it up, is the equality and accessibility of provision across the county. On the following 2 slides, they really graphically illustrate that there isn't a lack of activity in the space. There are a huge number of plans and strategies, some of which are statutorily required already in play. Child friendly, in many ways, part of its role will to cohere that activity, so as to ensure there's a synergy between our plans for youth justice and our plans for education, our plans for school improvements, and how that relates to the wider issues that impact on the situation of children, behavioural issues, issues of inclusion. So it is very much about drawing those strands together in a single cohering vision for the county. And as it says on slide 8, whilst there's no overarching requirement to have a single vision or plan, or indeed a partnership, there is that residual underlying duty. The previous plan ended in 2018, and to be honest, I don't think anybody mourned its passing because it wasn't particularly effective. And I know that was Chris's view when he arrived, that the partnership at that point wasn't that was delivering that, probably wasn't effective. Without being critical of any of the individuals involved in that, is probably because its purview and its membership was probably too narrow. I think what Dame Janet's been able to do, and I've been supporting her on that, is mobilising that wider commitment under the auspices of the Health and Wellbeing Board to engage the voluntary sector, the statutory sector, the faith sector, links with the commercial sector through the LEP, to make sure that our vision going forward encompasses all aspects that impact on children, from the economic, the personal, the social, the cultural, the health related, as well as issues of criminal justice. And slide 9 on page 42 sort of covers how that will be the governed, the child friendly, and the what we're calling the Wellbeing Coalition will very much be the children's partnership for the county. There will be a strong and ongoing dialogue with children and young people themselves through the Future Me project, so we can make sure there's a continuous iterative dialogue. Slides 10 and 11 really sum up what we found over the last 12 months as COVID has impacted those 3 areas that Janet alluded to around best start in life, pre-birth to 5, mental health, and transition to employment, resonate strongly with young people, but also have been highlighted as absolutely critical through the impact of COVID. Chris will know this week we've had particular challenges with the funding of the early years sector. You know, hugely important. It's £33 million worth of activity in the county, over 800 nurseries and childminders, and that sector needs to thrive because that educational offer is critical in ensuring children are ready to start school and get the best from their educational offer. So just final points, Chair, on slides 12 and 13. We when we launched this at the Sabrina Centre in December, we threw out a number of challenges, and that's for the coalition to have good cross-sector representation. We've got that the group's got a mandate from system leaders to really achieve meaningful change, so that the group would provide challenge, support, influence and assurance, and also that commitment to a sustained and authentic dialogue with young people through the Future Me programme and through other mechanisms we've put in place. And then in slide 13 of the next steps, we were hoping to have an inaugural meeting of the board in January. I don't think that's achievable now, but Dame Janet and I have just written out, or Dame Janet's written out to colleagues to say, let's have a bit of a pre-meeting in early February to ensure that as the pandemic eases, the board is well placed to convene, we would hope in March, and then really start to motor in the coming year. So I'll pause it there, Chair. I hope that's an overview and that the presentation gives you a good flavour of how we've mobilised the partnership. And Chris and Richard may want to comment, because they've got pivotal roles to play as the statutory duty holders as member and DCS, which have a big part to play in this programme. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Also a couple of things for me. Firstly, I loved the layout of this presentation. I thought it communicated really, really well. And thank you to you and Dame Janet for putting this together. I mean, I think this is definitely something that I think we should be kind of revisiting at future meetings. Now I've got two people. I've got Brian, Leslie. I've got one more. Is there any others? Yes, just Brian and Leslie, and
Well,
yes.
Lorraine as well.
Lorraine, right. Brian, Leslie and Lorraine.
And Stephen now.
And Stephen. Brian, Leslie, Lorraine, Stephen. Okay. Yes, so Brian. Oh, and Richard Boyles.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'd certainly welcome this this approach to have a plan for the well-being of young people. I think it's excellent, and the layout is very good. It does certainly make you feel you can access it and work with it. Just a couple of points on it, though. I think one of my concerns, it's good that we do comparisons with other areas, but there is a danger, I think, when you look at children as a mass, that you actually get a complacent sort of satisfaction of saying we're doing just as good as everywhere else, so we feel pretty smug about that, where actually our focus should be on the children, you know, whether it's 6 children or 100 children that need support. We need to be focused on them, irrespective of whether we're doing better than other areas or not. My second point really picks up on the key areas of focus, I think is on areas of immediate focus, area 11. The third one down, you talk about transition to employment, 16 to 19. My own view is that we should be looking at sort of 14 to 19 or 12 to 19, because those early days, once people have reached puberty, they start to develop their individual ambitions and ideas. They're very formative, and I think we need that ambition to be creating there. We need opportunities created there. 16 is too late for that. And my third point I'd like to make, which to me seems something missing from this report, which is the parent. Children's well-being is primarily the focus of the parent, the main responsibility of the parent. And I can't see them mentioned in this. And I think there's a danger if we try and take away from the parent the role that they've got, or demean the role into saying only other people can tell you if you're doing it right or wrong, or the way in which it's done. So I would have liked to have seen this report bigging up the role of the parent. And I think that's been brought to highlight this week when we've been talking about food parcels for children. And it just strikes me that the best person to understand what food needs to go into a child is mostly the parent. And the fact that they may struggle with having resources to do that doesn't mean to say that they don't have the ability to make good choices. And I'm hearing a lot, and this report seems to reflect this, that the state seems to want to take over the role of the parent. And I think that's a big mistake. If we do so, we will demean the role, and we'll probably make people less able or less confident to do it. So I would have liked to see this report making the role of the parent centre stage, or even if we accept it, sometimes that needs additional support. And I think we've missed a trick there. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Andy, or
yes, I'm happy to come on those. I think you've made a really interesting point on the parent, and it's not that we've ignored parents, but actually we wanted to focus on young people. And very often, we know that when dealing with early years children, it's going to be very difficult to get genuine views out of, birthing and children in the first year of their life and so on. So at certain points, parents will be proxies, if you like, for children and young people. And at some points, more particularly than at others. But I think what we wanted to do was make sure that young people were centre stage in our thinking, because very often the intermediary is more the focus than the young person. And I think I said that trying to get to the voice of the young person is going to be a really challenging thing to do. We ought to try and do it as much as we can, but we know that at certain points we should rightly go to parents and take their views. And I think that's going to be a balancing act, Brian. And I think you've set us a really difficult challenge to balance up when it's appropriate to go to the young person, when it's appropriate to go to the parent, when it's appropriate to go to the social worker, and so on. And that's the sort of coalition that we'll have to build out. On the other issue about complacency as a county, and whether we should be satisfied with what's in the middle, the average. And I can say this because I'm outside the county council, and I'll say it confidentially. I think too often we are satisfied, and we're too satisfied with just saying we're average. If you look at our comparator counties in some of this work, we're absolutely, so other shire counties, we're absolutely at the bottom of the performance table. And it's not good enough. And we all need to do much more to advocate for young people and to be there to make sure that the services are as good as they can be. And I think we're on the road, but we've got a long way to go.
Thank you. Chris, did you want to come in here? Chris Spencer?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's just in response to Councillor Robinson and the focus on vulnerable children vis-a-vis the general population. And of course, he makes a valid point. In response, the point I'd make would be that pretty much everything we do by statute, actually, Andy's already mentioned that we have to do this, is to improve services for vulnerable children, whether that be intervention in failing schools or schools of concern, or whether that be intervention in terms of improving services.
Chris, do you want to just take your video off it? You're breaking up a little bit.
Children known to children's social care. So we do an awful lot of that. But Andy and Dame Janet quite rightly remind us that we have other duties that relate to the general population. And I think that
we are really struggling.
We've just lost you, Chris.
Yeah, Andy, can I bring you in?
Thank you, Joe. Hopefully, children.
No, Chris, we are struggling. And I'd like to bring Andy in, who also wants to respond. If I could do that, Andy?
I'll be very brief, Chair. It was just to come back to Brian and reassure Brian. Brian's right. The emphasis on this report, as Janet said, has been very much around how we engage children, young people. I just want to reassure you that beneath this, there are quite a number of very robust mechanisms where parents will be consulted. So, for example, special educational needs, we have the Parent Participation Forum, where youth services are involved. There's dialogue with parents. So what we will do as this matures is be able to map out how we engage parents and how we engage young people. And sometimes there is a tension. So for example, what young people will tell us, older young people may say about access to mental health or sexual health services, we will need to think carefully around how we balance their rights to be heard with engagement with parents. But there is quite a robust architecture sitting underneath that. But it's a good shout, and as we develop, we'll be able to articulate and highlight how parents are involved in this agenda.
Thank you, Andy. I'd like to move on. I've got Leslie, Lorraine, Stephen Davis, and Bernie Fisher. If I've missed anyone, please do send me a private chat. Leslie?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the report, because it is very welcome. And I do have just sort of one or two, I don't call them thoughts about it. The first thing was the first sentence in the Our Vision. I sort of stumbled on the word, this has since been approved by the Health and Wellbeing Board. And I think what I would like to have seen is that this is being supported by the Health and Wellbeing Board. Approval sounds slightly sort of, I don't know, it just sort of struck a chord with me, but that's probably just me. What we've seen in the last months are highlighted to an extreme extent the inequalities in society, and I wondered how much had been thought about in knowing that the inequalities now are really writ large, and in certain parts of the county we see higher exclusions in schools, and poorer achieving schools. The areas you can look at them and you know the demographics will tell you. Matson, Stonehouse, the area I represent, and I wondered whether or not that's going to be rethought. Given that, two interesting reports have come out in the last couple of weeks. Marmot's produced a report looking at the inequalities, and yesterday the Rowntree Foundation, they too have come up. I mean, looking at poverty and areas. So these things will inform how we address the concerns of how Gloucestershire becomes as ambitious for its young people as it possibly could be. I wondered with the pledges, promises you've made, how they'll be measured. I mean, for instance, one of the ones you talk about is being happy. How does one measure that? Talk about transport, fair and equal opportunity. I wondered whether or not it would be worth having a sort of a one-day scrutiny into looking at these particular pledges, promises, to see how achievable they are, how relevant they are to making sure that we actually can get there with those. And you said, Janet, you want this particular scrutiny committee to be the people to look at it, and I wondered if it was something that this committee could actually have a look at to say, well, are these proposals achievable? Just a couple of things. Really thrilled to hear somebody saying we're not doing enough for the early years, the 0 to 5s. I'm probably boring to the point of not being heard every time I say this is an area that's just not given enough emphasis. So thank you for highlighting that one. And something that with the transition from for a young person from school into the next stage of their life. Some time ago, the county did have a working group looking at that, and then we were looking at sort of apprenticeships as well. And one of the conclusions that was reached there was that in preparation for moving on, certain GCEs are absolutely essential, even if, you know, whatever you want to do, but particularly with an apprenticeship. It's almost better to start, you know, as soon as they go into secondary education, sort of educating young people about what's needed to get into the world of work and helping that transition. And I think there was some literature produced which was going to go to schools that they could then give to students, but it might well be worth revisiting that sort of area. But I think it is fantastic. So if I could possibly, if there's one, the other thing I wondered was when you talked about the voice of young people not being heard in strategies and policies come out, in the same way that we do sort of impact assess on, well, what's this going to do to, will this policy affect the climate change agenda? Maybe we should ask the questions of some of the policies, or the policies that are produced, is, you know, where does the young person fit into this? What's the impact of them? And get them to play a part in their views. So, yes, fantastic. I think it's brilliant, and I welcome it. So thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. Dame Janet, did you want to respond at all?
Yes, I will just come back. I mean, there are a lot of points that you've raised, Leslie, and I don't think we can round them all off this morning. We will be tying ourselves absolutely closely to outcomes, but we've not had the first coalition board yet, and it's difficult to do that. I want to be judged by outcomes, which is why I value the commitment to come back to this group. But we have been echoing in some of our words the voices and the phrases that young people have given to us. And I was quite surprised by the fact that they kept coming back to us and saying, we want the world to be fairer. We want our lives, we want Gloucestershire to be fairer. So they are conscious of all these issues about equity and which slice of the cake they have, and whether it's the big portion of the cake or the little portion of the cake. And I think we've got to find the right metrics and put them into a dashboard where we can come back and convince you that we are making a difference. So it's work to be done, and we've taken the 3 areas of work because they seem to be very high on young people's agendas. We can't cover everything, and I suspect over 2 or 3 years we will start working down the other issues that pop up and become very important to young people. But all the way through, we've got to find a way of helping young people to articulate their voices and listen to them so that they can be fed into some of the debates that we think it's important to have.
Thank you, Dame Janet. I think that's absolutely right, and I think we're going to make a better society if we hear young people's views, which is why I'm always happy to hear when one of our ambassadors wants to ask a question. So do feel free to put your hand up if you're one of the ambassadors on the call today. I've got listed, I've got Lorraine, who's next, Stephen, Bernie, Richard, sorry, I forgot to mention you last time, and I will finish up with a question myself. If there's anybody else I've missed. Oh, Chris, did you want to come in again?
I don't think so, Chair. I think it's too painful for everybody, frankly. Right. I just keep putting your comment in the chat.
Yes. So everybody who's actually on this call, I'm sorry for those that are watching on YouTube, but for those who are actually part of the meeting, Chris has been posting a few comments on the chat. So can I move swiftly on to Lorraine, please?
Could I just interject? If Chris is saying things on chat, I think you as chair should read them out, because otherwise the public don't know what he's saying.
Yes, I think that's That's a good idea. So Chris, I think, wants to assure us that his service wouldn't be happy with mediocrity. I think that's one of the important points, reinforcing what Leslie was talking about earlier. And Leslie was making the point too on the chat that we should be building back better when we restore from COVID. But can I move on?
Not, Andrew, forgive me, not better, build back fairer.
Fairer, build back fairer, yes. Can I move on to Lorraine, who's been waiting a while for this? Lorraine.
Thank you, Chairman. Firstly, can I just say, Leslie, early years is not boring. I completely agree with you. The point I would like to make is I'm very pleased to see that this is directed at all children, not just those that are in the system or in care. With our children in care, we have lots of protocols in place regarding education. I'm talking about here, really. Where should they want to go into further education, etc., they are supported. There are children who are not classed as vulnerable, they're not vulnerable, but they may be disadvantaged in other ways, and they don't get that support, as far as I'm aware. And I think that we need to be pushing this so that parents are aware of whatever support is out there that they can access for their children. And not just in education, in other ways as well. So how do we get this out there in a wider way so that people who aren't aware of it know about it?
Dame Janet?
Yes, I mean, thank you. I think that's a very good point. We have been in touch with schools, and we've got really quite a powerful coalition board now. And I think over the next period, Lorraine, you will be seeing us doing much more to enhance the image, or to have a communication plan that actually does precisely what you want. And I suspect we will begin to have a dialogue with some of the diversity of voices that there are in Gloucestershire, and we will start to welcome that, because it's a way of picking up comments and real understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Is that okay, Lorraine? Good.
Chair, I think you muted. I think you might need to repeat what you've just said.
Okay, so thank you. I'd like to move on to Stephen, after which I have Bernie, Richard Bors. Alan Priest would like to ask a question, but is struggling with connectivity. So I'll try and either get him connected or read out any a question that he has from the chat, and I think I'll wrap up. Yes, one comment from Barley, one of our ambassadors. Might be worth noting, only 50% of care experienced young people are in education or employment. So that's from our ambassadors. So can I move on to Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for this report. I think it's really, really interesting. One of my questions was, clearly the ambition of this piece of work is all children in Gloucestershire. It states that very clearly. But I wonder how widely we're pushing this beyond those that some process or organisation is already identified as needing help. There are a lot of children out there who would not identify as needing help in some shape or form. And I wonder what we were trying to do to achieve that ambition of making Gloucestershire a good place for children, for those that are already not in contact with organisations.
Thank you, Stephen. Dame Janet? You're muted. You're still muted.
Janet, could you just unmute your microphone?
So this, sorry, that.
We might be having some connectivity problems, Janet.
Chair, I could answer Stephen's question if that would help.
Yes, that would help. Thank you, Andy.
Stephen, we've appointed a number of youth representatives under the Future Me project, and one of the things we're hoping to do is work with them to build the infrastructure to enable us to engage with a much wider and broader spectrum of children and young people. I think you're right. We tend to engage specific groups of young people around specific issues. What we're hoping with this, we've started some work already, is to build an interface or a digital platform which enables a much broader program of communication, and that will live on as this project develops. So it's early days, as Janet said. We're not as far on as we would like, but that is precisely the aim, that we build something that enables an authentic, continuing conversation at scale as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Bernie, can I bring you in now, please?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, apologies for being late. Gremlins in the computer system, but I got here eventually. Yeah, I really like the report, and I pick up on a couple of things that have been said. The 0 to 5s, I think, are where so much emphasis should be put, because the earlier you start with good systems and good education, and kids spot right from wrong quicker than anybody. They are much brighter than we give them credit for, and we should look at that, and we should try and get away from the injustices that they see. And there are injustices across society. We can see it, and it's getting worse. Whatever way you look at it, it is not improving the situation. But also pick up on what Dame Janet said, the average, doing the average lowers the average. And that is a mathematical fact. We should have a policy of continual improvement. 30 years ago, I was told to read a book by my boss called The Goal, which is a Japanese philosophy of engineering. It applies in life as well. It's continuous improvement from generation to generation, not just in wealth and things like that, but in qualities and in standards and in courtesies and in how you treat your fellow man. And it should be started from 0 to 5. You build on good foundations. I welcome the report and I thank them for it.
Thank you, Bernie. Do either Andy or Janet want to respond to that?
No, I mean that. So, I agree.
Right. Thank you. Richard Boyles.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. Dame Janet, I sent you a quick message in the chat to say that you're logged onto the system, into the meeting twice now, so that might be the reason for the echo. You're actually in two different places on the screen, but that's by the by. The first thing I'd like to do is thank Dame Janet Trotter and the Police and Crime Commissioner for setting this out and taking on this piece of work over the last few years. Andy Dempsey and Chris Spencer as well have been pivotal, linking in through the GCC in making sure that the County Council were able to understand the work going forward. And I myself have had regular contact with Martin Searle, the Police and Crime Commissioner, whose vision this was, to understand it and make sure we could add value, and I could go back and talk to Chris and our team about the progress that was being made and how we could add value to the research and the things that were required going forward to set it out. Post the launch now, it's a really important time. We were hearing the voices of children in Gloucestershire, not all of them. And when we did hear them, were we listening and were they landing and being recorded? And sometimes I think that wasn't the case. And so what we've got to do now with this platform that's been designed and with the work that's been put in place is capture all those voices and making sure that the vision can develop and grow. It's not just what's on the page today, but over the coming months and years, we will be able to amend and improve what we're trying to achieve for the young people in Gloucestershire. And I thought Leslie made a really important point earlier, which is that this pandemic has really brought into sharp focus some of the more obvious injustices that sit across not only our county, but the whole country. And it's how we start to tackle those, as well as all the other issues that affect young people and the opportunities that some of them don't get because of the circumstances they find themselves in. So I'd just like to say thank you for everyone this morning who's put in their contributions, but also reiterate the work that the PCC and Dame Janet have done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I think that was good, and I really like to echo those comments. I really do want to give praise to those people who set up this initiative, because I think it's going to have a potentially profound impact on our county for years or decades, in fact, to come. Alan, are you able to get on now?
I am at the moment, thank you, Chairman.
All right. Over to you then.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dame Janet and Andy for the report and the presentation. It's very interesting reading. I'm sorry if I'm repeating anything, because I did lose connection for about 10 minutes. Are we doing anything to specifically target schools? Maybe ask for an assembly presentation and encouraging children to respond maybe through a school project. And I think it's also vital to to present the report to districts, towns and parishes. I know at Lydney, we have our specific youth group on the town council. I think that would be an option to engage with more people and get the message out. But thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. Andy, did you want to respond to that in terms of engagement with schools?
Yeah, Chris is leading a piece of work at the moment with the schools partnerships around how we engage the whole of the school economy, and this project will form part of that. So it's a really good point. I think schools recognise the pandemic has really highlighted the pivotal importance of local relationships around all sorts of issues. So we are Janet and I are very conscious of that, and we are exploring how we link the coalition board. And if Chris can come back, I don't know if he can put it into the chat. Chris has also just revised the education strategy and set out a relationship with schools going forward. So we're starting to draw those links and not see education and social care and other aspects of provision for children as separate elements, but rather as a whole system in the county, and drawing those connections together. So as Janet said, it's in the early stages. And we're not as far on because of COVID, but that is certainly in our mind. And as Chris has just posted, Chris has invited Dame Janet to sit on the consultative forum that he's created with head teachers, precisely to ensure we've got those connections in play. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andy, for that, and thank you, Chris, for your post, which Andy read out. I think that was quite helpful, actually, in answering the question. I have just a couple of very brief questions to my end. The first one is a slightly technical one. I think when this came up at the Health and Wellbeing Board, I think I was substituting for Richard Boyles on that. I did mention or ask whether any consideration would be given to having a care leaver on the panel itself, on the board itself. Is that something that you had thought about, either of you, Chris or Andy? Andy or Dame Janet?
Can you unmute, Dame Janet? we've just got you once now. Andy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, we are working through those processes at the moment of how we link in the voice of children and young people up to and including whether we have a young person representative at the board, at the coalition board itself. And I think there are pros and cons to that, and we'll work with young people, the Future Me team and others to work that through, Chair. But it's certainly in our minds the best way to link young people into the board itself, maybe through direct membership or a shadow board process. But we'll certainly, that'll be one of the first things when the coalition is convened to explore and understand.
You're muted.
Andrew, you're muted, I think.
Unmute Dame Janet Trotter. Has that worked?
I've been trying, but unfortunately it's just not working, I'm afraid.
Right, okay.
Janet, do you want to log out and come back in again? It might work. Unless we're almost at the end of the item.
Yeah, we are quite close to it. There's just one further question I had. I mean, there was a reference to Gloucestershire sitting very much at the bottom, being an outlier on children's mental health, which does worry me. Is there any understanding of what the causes for that are, or are there any proposals to examine that and come up with some potential reasons? Perhaps Andy, can I ask you to respond on that?
Yeah, Chair, I couldn't unless Janet puts it in the chat. I'm not, when we talk about mental health performance, I'm not completely au fait with the particular metric that Janet's referring to. What I would say is that mental health provision, both access to specialist services and then at the more universal end, support for children's mental health and emotional well-being will be a key priority. I think one of the things that there's a lot of work going on through the Trailblazers programme, through the additional services that have been commissioned, like LinkedIn Plus. What we need to do, Chair, is really understand the reach and effectiveness of that activity is one of our, I think each of those three themes that we've highlighted to will be very much about partners working in each of those areas, agreeing where are we now. In some aspects, our performance may be good, bad or indifferent, but do we agree where we are now and what we need to do to improve outcomes for children and young people? So it will be part of the process in establishing, you know, in what ways is our performance comparatively good, but comparatively indifferent or comparatively poor. I don't think it's an overarching negative. I think it's mixed, but until we really map that out and understand it, I don't think it's just around raw outcomes in terms of timeliness and change for individual young people. One of the things Chris has highlighted is the accessibility of some service provision across the county. This is a huge geographic area, and whilst we might have good and effective services in some areas, are they accessible to all children in the county, which is the real raison d'etre for this programme. So we're on with it, Chair, and I think the first work that we do in each of those spaces will be mapping out provision, understanding performance, and then agreeing what we need to do to address any underperformance.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that. I don't have any more speakers indicating.
Yes, I wonder, please, if I may just come back for a moment, Andrew, please, because I did make a recommendation, and I should have said at the beginning. I mean, thank you very much, Janet, for driving this. I'm aware of how important it is to you, so I really do praise you for your tenacity. I think it's thank you very much. But I refer to our promises, and they are, they're an extremely good range, and I think Janet's absolutely right when she talks about outcomes. So my proposal was that we have a one-day sort of deep dive scrutiny to test the relevance of those proposals, because if we can't make them work, it's going to affect the outcomes. And I'm presuming that these promises have been have made with the support of the young people who've been involved in all this. And what we don't want to do is let them down. So, I mean, for instance, the one about access to safe and affordable transport, well, you've only got to consider, the geography of this county and understanding what transport's like in and around the place to say, well, how do we do that? So I'd say again, my recommendation was that we have some scrutiny around these promises to test how achievable they are, so that we're not setting ourselves up to fail from the beginning.
Okay.
Thank you for listening.
Okay, Leslie. I think I probably need to talk to either Joe or Andrea about that. I'm not sure if a full day is necessary, perhaps a half day.
Do you want to seek the views of the committee, Andrew, and see? Do you think that is something the committee want to do?
Yes, I think. Should we do that offline though? What I suggest is that Leslie, you're muted.
Together, it's so much easier than online. Another time, it's
Okay.
we're all here.
Okay. I invite contributions. Do feel free to raise your hand about whether you think a full day of scrutiny would be useful, or alternatively, if you've got any other ways that we think you could do that. Also, in terms of timing, in this council, certainly before May, I can't see us being able to do it. But you've got some suggestions on the appropriate timescales too. Can I invite contributions? Right. So I've got quite a few legacy hands here. If you're wanting to speak, can you just unmute and make a contribution on this topic?
Andrew, if I can come in, I did take my hand down, but put it back up again. But I support where Leslie's coming from. I think a full day might be too long, so I think my view would be, let's do it. But I think all day on, certainly if we're going to do it through this system, would be hard work. So can we make it a bit shorter than a whole day?
Yeah. Okay. So I think perhaps looking at a long half day. In terms of timescales, I mean, we don't have any more time, I think, before May, but perhaps after that.
When were you thinking, Leslie? Are you thinking this? What's your sort of timescale? In the next few months, or in the next 6 months?
I would have thought sooner rather than later. I mean, this document is now in the public arena, isn't it? And you'll have your board looking at things. So I would have thought, really sooner rather than later. I mean, we've got 4 months, haven't we, before the election?
With the chair's permission, if I send an email out after the meeting, we can arrange an informal committee WebEx meeting, and you can consider the pledges and the promises and do a piece of work outside of the committee. So I'll send something out after the meeting and seek everybody's thoughts, and we can look at a suitable date just to have an offline committee meeting where you talk up through the pledges and put something back to the March meeting.
Okay, and I think there's a strong possibility too that the May elections are going to be postponed, and we would also need reports from the areas where. Which will affect the promises. I mean, I'll stick to transport because we need to understand what transport is available. So it needs thinking. It needs thinking about how we do it. But I certainly do think the achievability of all this is relevant.
And it could be something. It could be something, Chair, that this committee put forward as a piece of work to the next committee. So that's quite feasible.
Yeah, sure. Okay. look, I think Joe, that's a sensible proposal. We know that there's there's some appetite, perhaps not for a full day, but for perhaps a long half day. Leslie's right that there has been some discussion in the press about the possible delay to an election due to COVID, so that might afford us some more time. So yes, we'll get something out after this meeting on that, and we'll hopefully we'll be able to make a decision by the March meeting about setting a date for that.
Andrew, I don't want us to let down all this good work that's gone on.
Andrew.
Hello.
It's Lorraine.
Lorraine.
Can I just say, Andrew and Joe, between now and say possibly the end of April, I won't be able to do anything like a half day or a whole day work. Thank you.
Right, for work commitments. Yeah, I understand. Okay, thanks.
Chair, could I come back? Dame Janet's asked me to communicate something because she can't dial in.
Right.
This is not meant to be unhelpful. It will be very lucky if the coalition board meets before March to start to base out some of this. So I think there's a concern Janet's got that what will you be scrutinising in effect, because we might not have started or given any materiality to these themed areas. That, I mean, the origin of those strategic commitments have come, just to reassure members, they have come from extensive dialogue with children and young people, and then cross-referenced that with the coalition to identify on the strategic themes. But so Dame Janet just wanted to say, absolutely welcome scrutiny input, but there is a danger you might not have anything to scrutinise given the current timetable if we're seeking to do something March, April.
Yeah, I think Leslie's point was more about setting targets.
Andrew, not even setting targets. It's actually saying, well, can we fulfil these promises? Can we fulfil the promise that everyone will be given everyone will have access to safe and affordable transport? Can we do that? And there's not much point in promising it if actually the current transport system won't allow it. So it is really about are these promises doable?
Yeah. So looking at the achievability, then presumably, I guess targets would come at a later stage. Then, look, I think it would be good to have an offline discussion about potential dates for this. So I'll take that up with Joe after the meeting, if that's all right. Yeah, I think I've got a nod there.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll send something out after the meeting once we've put something together. And include, I would say, Councillor Williams, we include Dame Janet, and we'll get some thoughts from Dame Janet after the meeting on the progress going forward with the board.
Yeah. Now, do members want a short break, or should we go on to the next item, which is Children's Services Quality Assurance?
Just go on.
Go on. Okay. So
I have to go to work afterwards.
Okay. In which case, Andy, it's you again, I think. I'll invite you to present the Children's Services Quality Assurance Report for November.
Chair, I think Rob, who's our head of QA, will do the detail. This is the regular report that sets out the findings of our case file auditing, where we look at a sample of practice across all aspects of children's social care, and the report summarises the overall conclusions. And for May, Chair, I'll hand over to Rob, who's joined the meeting, to take you through the report in detail.
Thank you very much. Rob.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andy. May I just do a quick sound check, given the difficulties that have been experienced? If folk could give me a wave or a thumbs up.
Yep, you're cool.
Super. Thank you very much. So yes, this is a report on the quality assurance activity undertaken in November, and we will focus ostensibly on the findings of the core audits. And very briefly, our persistently high rate of inadequate practice that was reported 24 months ago has reduced markedly in recent times. And I think a lot of that is credit to the leadership team when we think particularly of what's been faced over the last year. In addition to which, what we were seeing 24 months ago and previous to that was a reasonably high rate of inadequate practice that suggested imminent risk of harm to children. So that was the worst kind of unsafe practice. And that has become very infrequent now. So both the rate of inadequate and the severity of inadequate concerns has reduced markedly in recent months. And more practice has moved from inadequate to requires improvement. What we still face, though, is a high proportion of our requires improvement work is weak. And so taken together, the weak requires improvement and remaining inadequate practice accounts for around 40% of the work in the system at the moment. Therefore, whilst the trajectory is an improving one, and there are fewer instances of inadequate practice, we remain vulnerable to those more borderline examples being drawn down to inadequate practice. So the security of the progress has yet to be determined. Also, it is worth saying that over a 24-month period, whilst there has undoubtedly been good progress, the expected pace has yet to be realized. And we are just short of our target levels around inadequate practice within the short-term goals of the Accelerated Improvement Plan, where the target was 12%. We are on a quarterly level at 14%, so we're just shy of that target. What we're also seeing, and it relates very much to that pool of weaker practice that I was describing, is high variability month on month. So in the last 3 months, September, the rate of inadequate was 17%, October down to 8%, a significant drop, then November back up to 20%. And so what we're seeing is quite a high degree of volatility within that range. And so, as I say, more is needed to secure that, that weaker practice away from inadequate. The rate of good practice has also increased markedly. We're now fairly regularly seeing examples of outstanding practice, which is encouraging. Certainly not at the rate that we would like to see. Our aspiration is that a great deal of our work is outstanding. We're not yet there, but we are seeing instances of inadequate practice more regularly. And in something of an awards ceremony, Chris and I think Councillor Boyles are sharing out prizes to social workers in recognition of that good practice. And I think increasingly month on month, they're having to reach into their pockets to reward staff, which I think is wonderful. In terms of where there might be areas of remaining concern, our services for care leavers, as was mentioned at the last scrutiny committee, have dropped off somewhat. And I know that the improvement plan for care leavers will be in receipt of scrutiny. And at this afternoon's strategic performance and quality meeting, I suspect that that will be further reviewed, discussed, and a higher degree of response expected for our care leavers. In terms of the areas of our practice where attention is still needed, we still need to see work on management oversight. Work is still needed around analysis. We still see too many instances of drift and delay or risk assessment and review that isn't really reaching to the heart of the concerns and affording children greater safety. Still work to be done around our planning and certainly our permanent arrangements for children in care. And from a number of quarters, what we're starting to see is that whilst sometimes we do very good relational work, this is inconsistent, and more needs to be done in that regard. If I just speak very quickly to some of the interventions already in play to attend to these things, I know that the Leadership and Management Programme is currently underway, and that's being received quite favourably by all accounts from the managers that are attending that. And management oversight and accountability is quite strongly emphasised within it. There is work in train to develop training for our staff on analysis, and we're getting some other messages out to the system in advance of that. In terms of care planning and permanence, we have a project on permanence being led by Philip Segarula, who is assistant to Gail Hancock as the director. And the work on relational practice, a discussion last night amongst certain colleagues, has emphasized the commitment of the authority to a relational model of practice, and work is underway to advance that, with an improvement specialist leading the way in that regard. So hopefully we will start to see developments and building on the strengths of relational practice that are in place in Gloucestershire already. In terms of other final key points before I wrap up, attention remains needed in relation to our responses to audit findings for individual children, that we are closing the loop quicker on the findings and the recommendations so that the children benefit as a result in a much tighter feedback loop. And then we definitely have a need for greater involvement of children and family members in the audits themselves. This is a perennial challenge to us, and action was taken after the last strategic performance meeting where heads of service were reinforcing that in their respective areas, and that's subject to a watching brief. If we don't see improvement in that in the coming months, there is a discussion in train about how we will mandate that as part of our practice if it's not improving under a voluntary basis. I'm happy to stop at that point and field any questions or comments as needed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Rob. I don't have any new hands showing unless there's some. Has everybody removed their hands? So I've got 3 raised hands, but I think there may be legacy.
I have put my hand up again, but
okay.
You're doing.
Right. In which case, I'd like to take Brian.
Thank you. This is a fascinating report when you work your way through it. And it shows how complicated it is, I think, in delivering good practice and good outcomes on a consistent basis. And we can see the work that's going on there. I suppose my question, which may need to go to Chris, I suppose, is, or maybe Mitch Wolf, we've been for quite a few months now looking at the direction of travel, which is better, so that's good. But there are some teams which seem to be struggling to catch up. Is there any more that can be done to support these teams, or is it really a question of perhaps bringing different management techniques in, because not everything works the same way? But clearly we need to try and find ways to accelerate the weak areas so that we can actually deliver a good service, which is what we're aiming at. And whilst this is a fascinating report, and I see the pairing of the auditors, so to speak, is one initiative that looks like it might help. But I think we are looking to the management to say, what do we do to make sure we accelerate and bring those that are weaker into the strong position?
Can I bring Chris Spencer in at this point? I noticed.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Hopefully you can hear me. If not, I'll put it in the chat. Very briefly, we've appointed Simon Rushell, who is a lead inspector for Ofsted, or was until he joined our improvement team, to coach those team managers where the performance of those teams have been less than what we'd hoped, shall we say. And those teams where there is a higher proportion of inadequate practice. In fairness to those teams, they are characterised, generally speaking, by quite a high level of turnover. They tend to be those teams where we've suffered in terms of stability. So it's much more difficult to land improvement on shifting sands, as they say. But that's quite a comprehensive programme of support for those underperforming areas. but it's not all down to competence or willingness to work well or availability of support. Some of the performance is down to that shift in staffing still. But there is very good news on that front. We're now down to 79 agency workers. I always quote this, it was 187 when I arrived. And we then appointed a further 60, all of whom were agency. So if you add those two together, those two figures, you can see that we've reduced agency by something like 3/4. And of course, when you've got a permanent workforce, it does make improvements easier to land. Thank you, Chair.
That's good news. Can I just come back and ask Chris if he has a sort of timeline for when he feels the benefits of this recent work will start to pay off? Maybe he doesn't have that, but
so I think if we take what Rob has written in his report and the performance reports month on month, then actually it's already happening. We're already improving. The last focus visit by Ofsted made reference to the fact that the pace of improvement had picked up considerably since the previous monitoring visit. So I feel quite reassured by the pace of improvement now. And as I say, I think that's directly related to us continuing to stabilise the workforce and grow our own and offer them a good offer in terms of training and development to create better social workers.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, Andrew, Wells, can I just come in for a sec there?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, Brian, good points, well made, and thanks, Chris, for the comments just made. Chris and I talk about this issue on a weekly basis and discuss it in the Children's Bronzes and the improving plan that we have. We have got in place, I think, all the necessary building blocks to make sure that these teams and their managers are supported. We're running through the academy under Rob England and Rob Tyrrell, the appropriate support and educational courses necessary to bring the staff that we have up to the standard necessary to deliver good social work. So if I could just assure you that it's on our radar all the time, and we're working hard to make sure that all of the aspects of support are there in place for the people that need it, so we can deliver the right level of service. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. That's good and reassuring to hear. I've got Rich Castle. Stephen Davis, your hand still up? I assume.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah, I've got Leslie as well, but Richard's next.
Thank you, Chair, for that. This is really one for Rob, and as ever, thank you for the comprehensive reports you provide. My interest actually is in the general bit at paragraph 2.2, and you say, quote, despite a strong spirit of perseverance, fatigue is now regularly being reported, which of course I don't think would come as a surprise to anybody in the current climate. My interest in that is really, again, from the occupational health point of view. Do you intend to delve in any further in what are the prime drivers of that fatigue? Is it, for instance, because of the pressures at the operational level, i.e. dealing directly with children and young people, or is it more related to the pace of change itself and the demands being placed upon people? And will you also be looking at, as a consequence of any further work you might do on that element of it, whether there'll be any more resource implications? I mentioned this because I'm sure while we would all have hoped that Christmas would ride at a break, I can assure you within the education sector, it was anything but. So I'd just be interested in Rob's thoughts on that particular word and how, if at all, he intends to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, thank you, Councillor. In response to your question, I think from the outside, we could very easily surmise that the pressures on our staff are threefold. Number one is as you identify, social work is a very tough job on any day of the week. It's one of the jobs with the highest burnout rate of professionals. And so, yeah, it is a tough job, likely to induce fatigue on a good wicket. The second thing is that we are in a recovering authority, and let's not make any bones about that. That comes with considerable demand on our staff, so that those who are working hard, and I have little doubt that most of our staff, if not all of our staff, work extremely hard, they're being asked to do things differently and to do things better. That brings its own challenges and demands on anybody up and down the system. Thirdly, I think it's a challenge to us, what we're navigating locally, nationally, internationally, living in a pandemic. And by all accounts, 2020 was a really bumpy year. When we think, as Councillor Williams has highlighted, the Black Lives Matters movement and how that has impacted on us. Furthermore, just the views of political stability, stroke instability, the experience of Brexit, for good or otherwise. It was a tough year. So there was a constellation of factors that we can layer on to what is already a very tough job. And I think that led to a sense of a lot of people hoping Christmas would be restful. And I think some people found it restful. Some people found it an enforced rest with lockdown restrictions. And I think most people would agree that coming into 2021 has started off on somewhat of a disappointing footing. Not that there's anything we can do about that, but it is a tough start to the year. So I think all told, there are a number of factors that impose on our workers and induce fatigue. That's what any of us could round out. I think it's important that we're a little bit more scientific than that, because that's a conversation we could have had around the pub. But Rob Tyrrell, our principal social worker, is currently in the throes of finalising the social work health check, which goes beyond some of that conversational stuff and does more detailed work with our social workers and their managers to understand exactly their experiences. And we've deliberately touched on COVID within that. We also know that work in our HR department has been looking at staff morale and the like. And so those reports are being worked on now. And Rob is working through his final sets of focus groups to be able to finalize the data for that. And so we will have a more empirical view behind some of the more commonsensical stuff that we could comment on, and we'll be able to use that well. In terms of the other part of the query is around what support is in place for staff. I think it's fair to say that between our senior leaders, Gail, Chris, and Andy, and Wendy Williams, very consistent messages have been issued to our staff, not just around Christmas, but in the run into Christmas, about the supports available to them through our employee assistance program, occupational health, the support on offer by the team managers, etc. Those have been reinforced by corporate messages from Sarah Scott, Pete Bungard, that there is a lot of supportive gesture and emphasis towards the staff of Gloucestershire at the moment. I think we're going to have to continue to activate that moving into this year, but there genuinely are offers of support all across the system to our staff. I'm not sure that there's a lot more that can be done, but I'll happily hear from Chris or Andy if they wanted to add to that.
From my perspective, Rob, that's very reassuring, particularly the first part of your answer there. And it'll be interesting to see what the scientific analysis comes up with. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Rob, for that. I have to say, I spoke to an officer recently in a different service in GCC, and heard that this officer had been working some days 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. and I sort of shared that concern about the responsibility we've got to the health and safety of our staff. So I think that's really that's a really quite valid concern. Chris, did you want to comment on that at all?
Yes, please, Chair. Not to repeat what Rob says, because all of what he said is absolutely appropriate. It is the pressures of the day job, improving the service, as well as doing that day job in the context of a pandemic, which really is the worst crisis this country has faced since the last World War. But the impact of that pandemic is that families are less resilient, children experience more difficulties, there are more pressures on our workforce. The incidence of assaults and both verbal and physical are going up, and we're experiencing quite a lot of those now, certainly on a much more regular basis. And what we've done actually as a consequence of the lockdown is last week the senior leadership team instituted a 2-day pause to reflect on the increased transmissibility of the virus and to update and refresh our risk assessments and the support in terms of equipment, PPE, that we offer to our staff so that they feel safe when they go out on home visits. We did pause routine visits for 2 days to allow us to update those risk assessments. We didn't cease to visit vulnerable children where there were concerns about their safety, and all visits were reinstated at the start again of this week. And the staff really appreciated that. We've had a lot of positive feedback that the message is that the senior leadership does care about their staff. We're worried about their well-being and we take it seriously. I also am going to run staff webinars, the first of which is tomorrow, and up 2 more next week. And within 2 hours, we had 100 takers. And that webinar, both the first 2 webinars are full and were full within 2 hours, which is quite incredible. And I don't think it's anything to do with my particular draw as a personality or as a speaker. It's more to do with how hungry staff are for information to hear in what is quite a chaotic period, because we keep getting announcements by the day, and sometimes the announcements are contradictory from the previous announcement. So we have all sorts of problems that we're trying to resolve at the moment, like the early years funding issue, which is now largely resolved, free school meals, and you'll have heard all about those over the last few days in the media, remote learning, the quality of IT, testing of staff in schools. The latest announcement that I read this morning is that testing of staff is going to begin in primary schools on Monday. And schools are expected to react and put this in place, within a day or 2. And it's incredibly difficult. The list of critical workers for whom schools are supposed to provide a school place is quite a long list. And if all those parents who are eligible to take up those places took up their eligibility, we'd have over 50% of children attending school, which really does mean that the closure of school is a misnomer, really. None of our schools are closed, and there are more children attending this lockdown because of that critical worker list lengthening than last time around. So I've just given you a glimpse, really, of all the pressures that we're trying to deal with and support schools in managing and support our own staff with that backdrop. It's incredibly challenging. In 20 years as a director, there's nothing that's come anywhere near it. And people are working hard and they are working too long. But what can you do? What can you stop doing when children and families are in the need that they're in? So it's tough. And we're doing all we can. I think if there is an answer, it's around good communication and people feeling well informed and cared for as far as possible.
Thank you, Chris. I particularly welcome the testing for teachers in primary school. In fact, my own sister is a teacher. She took regular ONS tests and eventually ended up testing positive, I think at the end of November. So along with a few other people at the school. So that is a very welcome introduction. I've got Stephen Davis, Leslie Williams and Richard Boyles. If there's anybody else, please make yourself known to me. Stephen.
Thank you. And before I ask my question, which is critical, I do want to recognise that all the good work and hard work that's been done, and also that I do recognise that we are making improvements across the service, But every time I read the report on the audits, I come away depressed that we do not seem to be able to go forward in this area, and actually in some areas we are going backwards again. And I don't feel we ever get an answer as to why that might be. I mean, on page 59, we look for feedback from social workers whose practice was rated good or outstanding. Do we go and get feedback from those whose ratings on their audits requires improvement or inadequate, to understand how that came about and what else could be doing? Because as I say, this report doesn't reflect the good work and the improvements we're seeing in other areas. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, I think you've asked exactly the question that was really in my mind about persistence of some of these results. Rob?
Yeah, if I've heard correctly, there were two parts to that question that hopefully I can provide a satisfactory answer to. The one is about the inconsistency of the practice, and the second part was about the feedback and learning from those who are delivering less successful work. If I answer the second part first, and then I'll come on to the first part. In terms of that feedback, every audit that we undertake, well, just about 98%, is undertaken with the social worker and the team manager. So almost every example gives the opportunity for them to reflect on their practice, and we capture that. So yes, that is undertaken, and that is drawn into our learning. And the standing expectation is that the audit then provides an opportunity for a learning discussion between that practitioner and their manager. And certainly some of the findings that I've presented on identify where those consistent or thematic issues are in the weaknesses of our practice. So yes, absolutely, that feedback is sought and is utilized. In terms of the first part of the question, why is it inconsistent? Well, if I can give a general answer to that, and genuinely, this isn't a point of flannel, it's a fairly well understood view that in a recovery journey, it's absolutely normal to observe an ebb and flow. Now that sounds like a soft answer, but it isn't a soft answer. What you want your ebb and flow to indicate is 3 steps forward, possibly 1 or 2 back, rather than the other way around of 2 steps forwards and 3 back. So a successful recovery journey will look a lot like what we're seeing now in our system. Certainly not what we saw 18 months, 24 months ago, but what we're seeing now in the system is this ebb and flow, in that each month, hopefully the tide is coming in and we're seeing the rising watermark come up, which I think our data is demonstrating quarter on quarter, is that there is progress, we are moving. We've moved away from an incident rate of 40, sometimes 50% inadequate, down through 30%, through the 20s, and we're now regularly in the teens, and we're going up and down in the teens. That is an anticipated recovery journey. So as per the report, I think the key point to be made is the progress is absolutely there and was observed by the regulator in their 8th visit to us. However, we can be challenged on the pace. Our pace has been slow if you consider that the initial inspection was in 2017. But I know the point that Chris, as our DCS, has made in this forum is that when he came to post possibly 2.5 years ago now, I'm not altogether sure of the timescales, Chris, but he saw this as a several-year journey. And if you take our performance from a QA perspective, certainly in the last 22 months, that looks like a very regular, if not good, recovery journey compared to other authorities that report on, even those that become outstanding, but they report on that first 3 to 5 year need to move out of the inadequate period. So I think it is promising, but we remain challenged at pace. And the second challenge, as I point out in the report, is around securing that progress so that as the high water mark rises, we don't let it go back too far, but it consistently rises month on month. I hope that tends to the answers, the questions raised.
Thanks, Rob. Yes, just in the chat for everyone else's benefit. Chris Spencer made the point that you're not necessarily auditing the same staff. It's different staff being audited, and therefore there's some variability introduced through that. My challenge back, I guess, is well, is the month the right period over which to measure? Should we be measuring over 3 months instead to reduce that random element? But I wanted to report that comment from Chris. Leslie, I think you're the last one I've got.
Thank you very much. And I do think this is a frustrating report to read on a regular basis because, and I can understand Stephen's, concerns about it, but I think it is improving, and it is also understood why what needs to be done to get the improvement completely there, and also to ensure the sustainability that once it's there, it's got to stay there. So it's going in the right. I do believe it is going in the right direction. The other area I wanted to mention too was the resilience of staff, and I too talk to members of staff and hear and see the long hours they work. And it's a question I ask regularly about people's resilience. When you're working from home, I expect members find this too. The blessed computer is always there, and it's very hard to, if you're conscientious about these things, to not keep returning to it, to the detriment of oneself and the state of the house, perhaps. But it is difficult. And interestingly, there is a select committee in the House of Commons looking at burnout at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see what their findings are. But I do think it's something we should be concerned about. Lockdown is tough without the feeling that you're in a responsible position and that you can't ignore stuff. So everybody look after themselves, please. But we must look after our staff, who I think have been amazing during this time. And I do know some people work lunatically long hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Leslie. I couldn't agree more. We have some of our leadership in children's services. Some of them have been working some very long hours at particular points in time. It's been particularly stressful with things being new. So I think that's something we should remember and pass our commendations on to Chris and his team on that. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Chris, yourself.
Nothing really to add. I appreciate the comments. We have just started every week at senior leadership trying to think what it is that we could stop doing, but to be honest, there's not much. So I just think it's something we've got to suck up and get on with, frankly. We're public servants and we'll do what we can to serve the public in this crisis. I just don't imagine there's much we can stop doing. Most of what we do quite smartly, but it's still an incredible amount to get through. It's extraordinary times, and the only way I deal with it is to think of it as such. And if you're in extraordinary times, you need to undertake extraordinary things, and that's it really. Right. But I do think it's important for staff further down the food chain. Ultimately, senior leaders are paid a lot of money. I think where I'm really concerned is where we've got people in jobs which aren't paid particularly well, and they're working extraordinarily long hours, and without sometimes the recognition that other professions get. So we try and give it to them as frequently as we can.
Right, thank you, Chris. I'd just like to ask one question myself. I'm not sure if it's Chris or Rob that's best placed to answer. Probably the figure that stood out to me the most, and it does echo some of what Stephen was saying, was on page 54 with figure 3, and in particular the care leaver report. So over the last 3 months, we didn't have a single audit that was rated as good, and they were divided between RI and inadequate. I'm assuming that's largely down to COVID, but could you just and that we've got plans for restoring that, but could you just reassure me, Chris?
Yes, so the care leaver service is something we're acutely aware needs to improve. It's going through a state of change at the moment in that we're appointing more staff who are called professional assistants, personal assistants, rather than social workers, so that contact can become more regular. That's partly due to the fact that we've got increased duties for care leavers that go beyond the age range that previously we've had to care for them, but also to improve the service. We're remodelling the service so that there is a bespoke service. At the moment, they're part of the over 11s team and care leaving service. So there will be a greater degree of specialism going forward. They are subject to a particular improvement action plan, which is monitored on a regular basis by Gail and Phil Segarola, who has lead responsibility for that area. And of course, we are trying to work with our partners very closely, in particular district councils who provide some of those services to care leavers, like accommodation, which are critical actually to their well-being, and also with the short trust around those not in education, employment or training, because care leavers have suffered disproportionately during lockdown. 40 of our care leavers have lost their jobs recently. So, it's not a good time for our care leavers. So there's a lot of energy and effort going in to try and maintain and improve that service, because we're aware it's not good enough at the moment.
Reviewing our offer to care leavers, is it an annual basis we review that?
Well, I mean, we had that conference at the Gloucester Rugby Ground last February, so it's almost a year ago, and we had as an ambition for that meeting a number of promises for care leavers. One was around accommodation, another around leisure, another around employment, another around education. And it's true to say that while we've progressed on those promises to a degree, I think COVID has had a real impact on the progress of delivering on those promises for some of our partners, because of course these were promises that were offered at the time by our partners, like the district councils for accommodation, CCG for health, for example. So that has been very difficult to progress that agenda, but we are improving. The MHCLG lead on housing commended us recently for the progress we've made around housing, but it's quite superficial. If you scratch the surface and you visit the young people in their properties, or you hear about the standard of the properties, although the arrangements we put in place, whether that manifests in young people living in much better accommodation, I think we shouldn't rest on that particular laurel. There's still a lot of work to do.
I remember the conference. It seems a long time ago now. I remember the issue of accommodation. I remember one of our care leavers, and Batter, I think, said that she was being booted out of her accommodation. I think you managed to step in that instance, but that does concern me a bit. I mean, have you got plans to address that, or is it very much about?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah,
we keep a tracker, Chair, of young people who are at risk of eviction. At the moment, I can't remember the numbers on it, but last time, it comes up every Friday as part of the Bronze Team meeting, which Andy chairs. And last time I was present on a Friday to hear that, we had something like mid-teens, about 13, 14 that were at high risk of eviction. And if they are, we try and intervene to avoid that happening. Prevention is the best cure, to support the young person and the landlord. And there's a number of others who we obviously rate amber, who we also monitor very carefully to see whether their situation deteriorates. So I think we've got a good process in place to monitor the accommodation for care leavers, and particularly the risk of eviction, probably better than most authorities, I would say. But ultimately, it doesn't always prevent eviction because landlords base their decisions on the young people's behaviour ultimately. But it does, I think, save quite a few evictions taking place.
Thanks, Chris. That's certainly a topic I'll be looking at or keeping an eye on in future. I don't know if our ambassadors wanted to comment on that. No? Okay. Well, in that case, I wonder if we can move.
Sorry, I just put something in the chat.
Ah, Brill. That's Barley.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Do you want to read it out?
Yeah, I said regarding the care leavers report, a common theme I noticed within the performance report was with pathway plans, education and employment plans, and the SDQ, which are the strengths and weaknesses. I feel like these are all topics of motivation and aspiration for care leavers, and children in care and care leavers are reminded of their strengths, goals and aspirations. And I feel like this is really important during this pandemic because it's something that everyone, any normal person is experiencing.
Yes. Thanks for that, Barley. Thanks for raising that. Chris, do you want to come back on that?
Well, you know, it's great that Barley's here, and I'm not sure whether Barley's going to be a regular mentor of mine, but she pitched up at my last mentoring session along with others, and usually Em and Eliza also come along, and Becca's been there as well. So, you know, the best source of information I get is from them, and I know that other ambassadors mentor other members of the senior leadership team, and you know, they tell it as it is, and it is as it is when you look into it, and so, you know, we take their views and their challenges very seriously, and usually when we look at what they're saying, there's a lot of substance to it, and so, you know, that pipeline, if you like, of intelligence is highly valued by us and will continue to be so as long as they keep turning up regularly and beating me up about things. Then that long may that carry on.
Great. I think it's great that you're having those reverse mentoring sessions, actually, Chris. I think that really is good. I really do need to press on to the last, I think it's the last agenda item, revenue monitoring. So really apologies to Suzanne, who's had to wait to the end. I'm afraid you've always been at the end, Suzanne. So it's I beg your pardon. We've got agenda item 7, the services report.
I think we've missed an item there, Andrew.
Yes.
We're on item 7, performance reporting.
So do we have Kelly at the meeting, or will you take that, Andy?
I think this one is for Chris, if Chris is able to do this.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. So this is the standard performance report that you get every time we meet. So I'm not going to go through it in detail. I think the best thing, Chair, is for people to raise any issues in relation to performance and the report. The best place to look is in the summary at the front, which kind of highlights things that we're progressing quickly, others that are moving in the right direction, but perhaps less quickly than we'd want to, and others where there is a real issue that we need to address. Those that are RAG rated red should be reflected in the accelerated improvement plan. And there was a bit of a disconnect there a few months ago. We've made certain that there's a golden thread now between our improvement plans, the performance report and the QA reports. So that you should, if you read all of those reports see the links between the three now, and that one is linked to the other, and makes sense as a raft of intelligence, both soft intelligence and hard data.
I think you're muted, Andrew.
I've got several hands up, and I'm not sure if they're legacy hands or new hands. So if you don't want to speak, lower your hand now. Right, okay. So I have Brian. Apologies if these aren't in the order of raised. Richard Castle. I think just the two. Brian?
Thank you, Chair. Two points really. One, I note that we are still not very good at recording information. This is something that Ofsted have mentioned in the past as well. We provided better equipment, and I think we've invested in a system that allows us to record information sort of direct from any type of equipment. I would have thought that was actually a time saver and something that would allow us to work more effectively. I'm sure that's what it was intended for. So it seems a bit strange that we're not using that, because it feels like we're therefore doing things in a more complicated way than we need to. So is it that people aren't using the system as intended, or is the system not really up to what it was supposed to be there for? So that's one question. And the second one really was around the, I think which page it's on, it's in the executive summary, when you talk about the significant proportion of episodes where there's non-engagement, where they no longer wish to engage. And I wondered what could be done to try and improve that, because clearly in early help, the more that could be done there, the better it is for everybody. If there's non-engagement, so are there techniques we can use perhaps to improve the engagement process? Thanks.
And I think I guess that's down to Chris.
Yeah, I think so. I think unless Rob's still on the line, but just in relation to recording information, that is a perennial challenge for the senior leadership team to improve the quality of recording and the frequency, actually, to make certain that people record notes in real time is really important, especially when you've got staff turnover. And in the past, we suffered hugely from staff moving on without updating files. But of course, given the news that we shared earlier about the number of agency reducing, that is a problem that is proportionately reducing as well. But we're never there. It's one of those that you never actually get to a finish point, Councillor. I think certainly as a senior leadership team, we keep re-emphasising, I know Gail does in her leadership teams with social workers, how important that is. Heads of service emphasise it in their management oversight meetings with their team managers, and likewise team managers with their frontline social workers. The system itself is a pretty good one. Liquid Logic is one of the best on the market. It's probably not my first choice, if I'm honest. I think Mosaic, which is the brother of Framework I, is a better system that I've worked with. But Liquid Logic isn't far behind in terms of its utility. But we do have an old version of it. And I do think we're going to have to update that version of it as soon as possible. And we do have also a small team of people who are continually updating it so that it has greater utility. So and less steps to get to a certain point. Sometimes the system is set up in a way that you have to go through 14 steps to get to where you want to get to. And if you refine that system, you can probably half that. So we're improving it all the time. But I think the honest answer is that we probably need a newer version at some point. It's not business critical at this moment in time, but ideally we'd have the latest version of that particular system. The issue around disengagement, Unfortunately, I did read all the papers, of course. I don't have them in front of me, and I think that particular RAG rating relates to care leavers. If it doesn't, forgive me, but I think it does.
It's under early help, but as it's the second bit under your executive summary called early help. So.
Oh, okay. So it's something quite different then, in that this is more about families' willingness to engage in early help, and I think that comes down often to the way that offer of help is introduced to families. You know, whether that's usually through a partner, like a school or like the police, health, or whatever. And so I think there are messages for our partners in terms of how you introduce that. Normally, if you mention social work at that stage, people run a mile if it's consensual, which it is in terms of early help. They have a choice about whether they engage or not. And of course, if the services aren't effective, then people will disengage if they have a choice. And so the better our services get, the less disengagement we should be experiencing. So while it's still an issue, I do think that the incidence of disengagement will reduce. We talked earlier, didn't we, about adolescent engagement, particularly in the youth offending system. And where there is consent required, I think we need to become better at selling what we've got to offer.
Thanks for that. I think one of the things that strikes me then, that COVID, if the early help is actually often done with schools or through the police or something, that actually less access to those during COVID may well be part of the cause then, that the people that are trusted are less present on the scene, which may have an issue for social work.
Yeah, the sort of contraindication, interestingly though, is that the requests for early help have gone through the roof during COVID. So we might have a higher level of disengagement, but we've got a higher level of requests for services as well. So 40% increase last time we looked at the contacts through the MASH dashboard.
Great, Chris. I think Andy Dempsey wanted to come in to clarify something as well, and then I've got a kind of like supplementary to Brian's question afterwards.
Yeah, could I just be clear that narrative in the exec summary isn't 24 and 14% of the total level of activity. That's the proportion of cases that were closed that were due to non-engagement. So it's a proportion of a proportion. What we do is we look at the outcome of the work that we do, and it's the proportion of the closures or the endpoints there are withdrawal of consent or non-engagements. And as Chris said, that may then accelerate that to statutory services depending on our level of concern. Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that.
Much, Andy, for clarifying. My question was supplementary to Brian's. Is you mentioned that we're lagging behind on the Liquid Logic version. What are the impediments, Chris, to keeping track with the latest versions? And if we do that, aren't we sending the right sort of messages to staff that we're maximally supporting them to do the best job we can?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with our system. As I say, Liquid Logic is one of the two best systems, I would say, that's available to social workers. If there's a problem with it, with ours, then I would say it's related to the fact that it's an older version. There's also, of course, I'm not sure who just flashed it up, it was Andy, I think, but there is also the problem of what it sits on. And if you're, I'm not particularly IT literate, but if you use an IT system like Liquid Logic, it sits upon our own infrastructure. And our own infrastructure is quite creaky, as you will know, quite an old infrastructure. So there are issues around how those two systems relate. And of course, at the moment, Sopra Steria is the IT contractor, and we are in dispute with them. So they're not responding to our concerns as speedily as they perhaps might have done in the past. And as that contract draws ever closer to ending, they become less speedy, shall we say, at responding to our concerns and requests for help. So there are kind of wider system issues, but it doesn't exclude what Brian is raising, and that is that the system is still fit for purpose, and the primary issue isn't the system, it's the fact that we don't always get our teams to record their work in a thorough enough way or in a timely enough way. We're not there yet. It's a heck of a lot better than it was, but it's still an issue for us, and we can't, as I said earlier, in relation to a different topic, none of us are happy with mediocrity. We want to be better. And as Councillor Fisher said, that continuous cycle of improvement is critical. It never stops.
Thanks, Chris. I wasn't aware, actually, of the issues of Sopra Steria. I assume that's public domain, is it now? Well, now that we've mentioned it on the...
Well, it is now, I guess.
It's now, yeah, is the answer. Right. Okay. Right. Okay, fine. I've got Richard Castle, and I'll just see if I've got anybody else who's indicated. I don't think so. Richard, you'll be the last person on this agenda item, and then we will have to move to item 8. And I've got a hard stop at 1 o'clock, which is slightly problematic. But yes, if we go ahead and we can, you'll be the last one on this item.
Thank you, Chair. And it's a very straightforward one and a very quick one. But I'm afraid this is slightly down in the weeds, Chris, if you haven't got the papers in front of you. It's on page 30 of your report and 98 of the bundle, and it's around the child protection era. And this just struck me as something that I just didn't quite get it. Given that drugs and alcohol are often prevalent in the setting for child protection issues, or indeed can be the recourse that young people take to escape emotional pressure, I was just interested that in the graph of attendance at strategy discussions, which notes the police and everybody else, that the Drug and Alcohol Agency don't appear to have attended any meetings, and that I assume is CGL. I just wondered, had they not been involved at all? Is it a conscious decision not to invite them? I was just interested because it stuck out to me. Thank you.
Yeah, really good question, Richard. I don't know if Andy know the answer to that. I don't, unfortunately.
Can I? Yes, I could, Chair. The treatment offer through CGL and the engagement in treatment are less mandated by the court is voluntary. It may be, firstly, that in this cycle, the adults involved, although they had a substance misuse issue, were not actively involved or participating in treatment. So the CGL connection is strong. That suggests to me that we're in those child protection inquiries and strategy discussions, that we didn't identify the adults as being in treatment, because often they're not in treatment, or what we call treatment naive, hence the problems that are playing out in the family. But I'll certainly come back and look at that. I'm fairly confident that there were no occasions when the adults involved were open to CGL, and therefore we could engage them through this process. It is quite exceptional, actually. Our problem is that many of the adults who are caught up in child protection inquiries where substance or alcohol misuse is present is precisely because they're not engaging with treatment. But I can give a definitive answer, Chair, as we go along. And just to reassure you, our links with CGL are very strong through the MASH, so they are involved in that type of discovery.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Rob, did you want to come in here?
It was really only an extension of what Andy was going to say, so I won't repeat what he was saying, but also to recognise the step-by-step process of child protection, where strategy discussions are usually towards the front end of that process, and we would see the process maturing and CGL being brought on later in the process for the points that Andy has made. And so we would expect to see greater participation through the Section 47 inquiry, where we're making investigations, and we might have exploratory discussions with CGL. But certainly as the programme develops, or the plan develops, they would be on board as part of child protection conferences. And that's really where we would expect to see their involvement, is in the child protection conferences, rather than the strategy discussion necessarily.
Thanks, Rob. So message from Andy, we might want participation in treatment part of the plan. Okay. We really do have to move on, I think, to agenda item 8. Apologies to Suzanne. It's page 131 of our acts. So over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Chair, for that. So this report is the same that was mentioned at the budget scrutiny last week. So hopefully the numbers and the detail are very familiar to most people. The overspend, as we said last week, is 14.6, and this is the October report, forecast done in October. And that also includes about 6.9 million of COVID-related expenditure. I mean, it is difficult to identify some of the impacts of COVID, but it is significant. And as we've pointed out over the last few months, those key areas that we're seeing an impact are on the external placement costs, homeschool transport, transitions for care leavers, staffing, and some support to vulnerable pupils as they return to school. And I think what we also mentioned last week was that the January position, which will be published in the next few weeks, that will go to Cabinet, also looks to see that position, the net position, which is 7.6 in October, is potentially reduced to 6.6 million, a £1 million reduction due to some reductions in transport costs, mainly to do with having additional grants from the government for to pick up the COVID costs, and also in some staffing, and that's linked to the work that we've been doing to reduce over-establishments, reduce the number of agency staff, and to bring in our newly qualified cohort over the last few months. So a really good outcome in that position. Just picking up then just some of the key variances, so that, and then hand over to you for any questions. The external placement budget still continues to be our main area of overspend at 9.2 million. There are a significant amount of COVID costs in that of nearly 4.2, so an underlying position of about 5 million. Although it should be pointed out, as was picked up last week, that the children in care numbers, when this report was written, were 764, now they're over 800. So we're likely to see some pressure on this budget over the next few months. And what we'll need to identify is whether that is COVID related due to young people not being able to transition to more permanent accommodation, or it's an underlying position with children in care. So there is some further work to be done on that. The other area that obviously we've mentioned is the staffing costs. At this point, there were 1.5 million overspent, but that included 400k for a contingency for COVID-related costs. The other significant overspend is the homeschool transport. And as I've said, that has seen a reduction recently due to additional information and also because of the grant that we're now getting from the government for the cost for COVID. And I think there's been some catch up with the homeschool transport team in terms of looking at routes, making sure we're not double counting, and ensuring that the information is now accurate. In terms of just moving on then to the dedicated schools grant position, as we pointed out over the last few months, the overspend is 14.4 million, but does include a deficit carry forward of 8.4 million. And also the budget was actually set much higher because of the pressure and to be able to set a realistic budget. And it's really interesting to note that this isn't the worst. Was probably in the middle of where a lot of local authorities are and the pressure that local authorities are facing on their high needs budget due to the two things really: the increase in education, health and care plans, and the upward trend on that between 3 and 350 per year, but also the need to cater for young people who need specialist education, and that is putting pressure on our special school capacity, which is nearly at capacity. Therefore, young people are being placed in independent provision, therefore causing the budget to overspend. So those are some of the key variances for the committee to note, and happy to take questions.
Suzanne, I have just two indicating that I saw Brian and Leslie. I really like to cut it off at that because I have a fairly hard stop at 1, and I think probably people will be wanting their lunch. So over to you, Brian.
Can I just make a suggestion that if there are any questions at all, if members would like to email to me, I will forward them to Suzanne, and we will include in the minutes with the responses.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on, Brian.
That sounds an excellent suggestion. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. My question really comes out of the current situation we are with schools at the moment, where they're closed and the children aren't at school, but actually they're all open, and I don't know, up to 50% of the children are in the schools, but they're not delivering the normal school curriculum. They're doing something else, and also then trying to teach the ones that aren't in school online. My question is, what's the impact of that on budgets, and is it all being covered by government? Because it seems the schools are trying to do twice as much as they would normally do in the current climate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Suzanne?
Okay, so I'll just do a quick response, and Chris may want to add into that. So we haven't reduced any of the funding that schools are getting. So they're getting everything that that was delegated to them from the beginning of the year. So we haven't cut any funding. So they're getting all that. In terms of additional costs, they have been able to apply to the government for additional costs of running the school, particularly whether that's staffing related costs, cleaning, and a number of other areas which they've been able to apply to the Centre for the DFE for additional funding. Clearly, schools are under pressure, and I know they are lobbying government to provide additional capacity or cost to be able to cover the additional costs that they've got. So we're providing all we can as a local authority, and those additional costs are, if they are, then schools should be looking to the government, the DFE, to be providing additional support there.
Thank you. Brian, is that, you happy?
Sorry, I didn't have the mute. I was muted when I said thank you. That's fine. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Leslie? Lastly, Leslie?
Thank you very much. And I did put in the chat, I think this report should go first. Poor Suzanne, she's very patient, sits there, and this report really doesn't get the scrutiny it deserves. But I think we should try and find another way of doing it. But so please, can we think about that one? And now I might have missed it because I was getting a message coming through on my phone, and I wanted to check about the homeschool transport, because you've had a grant for, I can't see it now. You've had a grant, presumably a central government grant of not a lot, and there's an overspend there, and I suspect there's going to be more to come. Are we expecting any more money from central government to try and mitigate these area?
To be fair, the DFE have responded very well to the returns we put in for COVID-related costs. So as at the end of the current terms, we've got all we've asked for in terms of covering COVID-related costs, and it's whether they give us money for the last term will depend whether we've got additional costs or not. But no, we are getting most of the cost reimbursed centrally, so that's good. I mean, the overspend was there at the beginning of the year, and it is to do with SEN costs, the activity, but also the cost of reprocuring new routes, which are now transport costing us more than it did. And I think we're beginning to see that coming through in the cost of routes. And that's why the MTFS proposes putting additional funding in to cover that for the next financial year.
And are you happy with that, Suzanne? You have a level of confidence.
Yes, I am. Yes, I think the amount that's coming in to cover COVID is what we've requested on our best estimates. And the figure we've got in for next year seems to be a realistic value of what we might need. Clearly, nobody knows the impact of what that may have on SEN provision and the costs and transport providers, but we've done the best we can to put in a realistic bid for next year.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Suzanne. If anyone has any more questions, please do email it in to Joe. Joe, can we take an action for the next agenda item to have finance first so it gets a little bit more time?
Yes, I'll make a note of that and forward that on to my colleague, Andrea Clark.
There was a proposal, I think, from another committee member, Colin Hayes, some time ago, that when we were online, we might consider starting at 9:30 as well. So that's something that the committee would be, while we're meeting online, would be willing to do.
Try
it, yeah. Okay. So, Joe, can we also take that on board to consider a 9:30 start where we are meeting virtually?
Yeah, I'll make a note of that. Thank you. And I just need to add in that we have received apologies from Councillor Colin Hay for this meeting.
Right, it was Colin actually who mentioned that for meetings ago, I think. Right, thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the officers who have presented. Thank you to the members who've come and participated and asked questions or just simply absorbed it. So I'd like to, I don't know if I wish you all a happy new year at the start, but a happy new year, and look forward to the rest of this term of the county council, however long that is. Thank you very much. Oh, and yes, and thank you particularly to Joe, as Leslie's reminded me, for covering for Andrea. And could you pass the committee's best wishes on to Andrea, and hope she gets better quickly.
Thank you, I will. Thank you very much.